You may believe you have lost your ambition, but something more unsettling has happened. You have begun to see through the life you once wanted. The future that used to pull you forward now feels like a room you spent years decorating for a person you no longer are. You can still remember why you wanted it. You can still explain it convincingly. Yet when you imagine finally possessing it, your body does not move toward it. Something in you goes quiet. You may call this confusion, ingratitude, or failure. You may accuse yourself of wasting time, abandoning your potential, or becoming too detached to care about ordinary life. But Carl Jung spent decades studying precisely this kind of rupture. Jung understood that the psyche does not always cooperate with the plans made by the conscious personality. When a life has been built around adaptation, rather than inner truth, the unconscious eventually withdraws its energy. What once seemed meaningful becomes strangely lifeless, not because you have become incapable of desire, but because the desire itself has completed its psychological purpose. That distinction matters. You are not merely tired of a goal. You are encountering the difference between what your ego selected and what your deeper life can continue to support. The job, relationship, status, home, social identity, or imagined future may once have carried genuine emotional force. It may even have saved you during an earlier chapter. It gave you direction when you needed direction. It helped you organize your effort. It offered a picture of belonging. But a psychological structure can be necessary without being permanent. Old souls often suffer here because they mistake their depth of reflection for a duty to remain loyal to every former version of themselves. You remember what a dream meant when you first formed it. You remember the hope attached to it, the sacrifices made for it, and the people who believed you when you spoke about it. Letting the dream die can feel like betraying all of that. So you keep the image alive after the feeling has left it. You continue rehearsing a future that no longer contains you. The detachment arrives quietly. You stop checking the opportunity you once obsessed over. You delay decisions that should excite you. Praise lands without warmth. A room full of people discussing the very success you used to envy leaves you feeling as if you are listening through a wall. Then shame appears. You assume that if you were healthy, disciplined, or grateful enough, you would want what you used to want. Jung mapped this loss of fascination as part of the movement toward individuation. Individuation is not self-improvement in the ordinary sense. It is the difficult process by which the personality becomes less governed by collective expectations and more answerable to the total psyche. It begins when the identity that helped you function becomes too narrow for what is trying to emerge. The withdrawal of desire is often the first sign that an old agreement between your conscious life and your unconscious life has expired. This is why your detachment can feel both empty and strangely honest. The ego experiences the loss of a goal as deprivation. The deeper psyche experiences it as the release of trapped energy. You stand between those two realities. The old world no longer persuades you, while the new one has not yet taken form. Jung treated such intervals seriously because they expose a person to projection, regression, and despair. Without an outer object to carry meaning, you are forced to discover where meaning was actually coming from. The psychological mechanism is a withdrawal of projection. For years, you may have projected inner qualities onto an outer future. Freedom was projected onto money. Worth was projected onto recognition. Safety was projected onto a partner. Wholeness was projected onto the perfect home, the impressive title, the transformed body, or the approving gaze of people who once underestimated you. The goal felt radiant because it carried parts of your own unlived psyche. When the projection withdraws, the object looks ordinary again. You may think the world has gone gray, when in fact your own psychic light is returning to its source. One person opens the same career website every morning before getting out of bed. His thumb scrolls past roles with higher salaries and better titles, but he no longer imagines himself inside them. At lunch, he closes his office door softly and sits without turning on the light. When a colleague asks about his 5-year plan, he smiles, lifts his coffee, and leaves the sentence unfinished. What looks like indecision from the outside may be a psyche refusing to make another binding promise before it knows what is true. Yet if this remains unconscious, you can become trapped. You may numb the emptiness, force yourself back into the old ambition, or attach the same projection to a new person, place, or spiritual identity. Then the pattern repeats. The surface changes, but the inner bargain remains untouched. The danger is not that you have become detached. The danger is that you will misunderstand the detachment and use it against yourself. Your old desire may have belonged to the persona rather than the whole personality. Jung used the word persona for the social face that allows you to participate in collective life. The persona is not false in itself. You need it to work, speak, belong, and meet the expectations of a shared world. The problem begins when you identify with it so completely that you confuse social usefulness with personal truth. Then you do not merely perform a role. You believe the role is the full measure of who you are. Perhaps you became the competent one, the exceptional one, the healer, the provider, the rebel, the good child, or the person who would one day prove everyone wrong. Each identity carried a corresponding future. The competent one wanted authority. The exceptional one wanted recognition. The healer wanted to be needed. The provider wanted visible security. The rejected child wanted a life impressive enough to reverse an old humiliation. The dream was never only about the dream. It was the destination promised by the persona. A woman keeps a folder of apartment photographs she saved for 6 years. White walls, tall windows, a kitchen designed for gatherings. One evening she opens the folder after receiving the promotion that could finally pay for it. She studies the images, closes the laptop, and begins washing a cup that is already clean. When her sister calls to celebrate, she says she is tired and changes the subject. Her indifference is not proof that the years were meaningless. The apartment once represented escape, dignity, and adulthood, but the image continued demanding loyalty after those inner needs had changed. In the same way, your old dream may have carried you across a necessary distance without being the place where you were meant to remain. What you are calling a loss of ambition may be the end of your unconscious obedience to a role that has already taught you everything it could. The collapse of desire often reveals how much of your striving was organized around compensation. Jung observed that the psyche compensates for one-sided conscious attitudes. When you feel small, you may construct a grand future. When you feel powerless, you may become obsessed with control. When you feel unseen, you may imagine an audience. When belonging feels uncertain, you may make yourself indispensable. These ambitions can produce real achievement, but their emotional intensity comes from an old wound trying to create its opposite. Compensation is not deceit. It is an intelligent attempt to restore balance. The child who felt helpless may need the fantasy of future power in order to survive the present. The young adult who felt ashamed of poverty may need a vision of wealth to mobilize effort. The lonely person may need the promise of perfect love to remain open to life. But what protects you in one season can imprison you in another. If the wound becomes less dominant, or if the psyche is ready to meet it directly, the compensatory future loses voltage. A man still tells friends that he plans to build a company large enough to retire before 40. At night, he opens a spreadsheet, changes 2 revenue projections, and stares at the cells without reading them. A notification announces another entrepreneur's success, and his hand reaches automatically for the phone. Instead of envy, he feels only fatigue, then places the phone face down and listens to the refrigerator hum. The fatigue is information. His ambition may have been carrying a younger self's promise that no one would ever dismiss him again. Once that bargain becomes visible, the business can be chosen freely, changed, or released. Until then, every goal is forced to serve as evidence in a trial that ended years ago. What you have been calling laziness may be the exhaustion of using your future to argue with your past. Detachment intensifies when projection begins to return from the world. Jung treated projection as one of the most consequential operations of the unconscious. You encounter an outer object, then unknowingly cover it with inner material. A person appears to possess the aliveness you have disowned. A city seems to contain your freedom. A career seems to guarantee your significance. A spiritual path seems to offer permanent purity. You do not merely want the object. You want reunion with the psychic quality you have placed inside it. This explains why desire can once feel sacred and later seem almost embarrassing. The object has not necessarily changed. The projection has weakened. You see the relationship, role, or destination with fewer of your own images cast upon it. The glamour fades, and ordinary reality returns. This can feel cruel because projection gives life color. It creates longing, romance, purpose, and momentum. Its withdrawal can resemble depression, even when it is also a movement toward greater psychological truth. You should not romanticize this. Persistent loss of pleasure, impaired functioning, or deep hopelessness deserves professional attention. Jungian meaning does not cancel clinical reality, yet clinical care and symbolic understanding can exist together. You can take your suffering seriously without assuming every collapse of desire is a defect to be repaired back into conformity. A woman visits the neighborhood where she once dreamed of living. She walks past the cafes she had bookmarked and stands outside the building whose balconies appeared in her vision board. A real estate notification lights her screen. She swipes it away, buys a bottle of water, and sits on a bench watching residents carry groceries through the entrance. For the first time, the building looks like a building. That ordinariness is painful because the projected future once held concentrated hope. But the hope did not vanish. It has become available for a more difficult task, discovering the freedom, beauty, or belonging that the object symbolized, and beginning to cultivate a real relationship with those qualities inside your present life. What you are experiencing as disenchantment may be your own unlived life asking to be reclaimed from the objects that carried it for you. The empty interval is not a mistake. It is the psychological space in which a new center can form. Jung described the ego as the center of consciousness, but not the center of the entire psyche. He used the term self for the greater ordering principle that includes conscious and unconscious life. Individuation requires a change in relationship between ego and self. The ego does not disappear. It stops behaving as if its plans are the only legitimate source of direction. When an old life loses meaning, the ego demands a replacement. It wants a new goal by Friday, a new identity before anyone asks questions, and a clear explanation that turns uncertainty into progress. But the unconscious rarely develops according to that schedule. Images, moods, dreams, resistances, and small attractions begin rearranging the inner field before a coherent direction becomes visible. You are asked to tolerate a period in which your life cannot be summarized neatly. This is especially difficult if you have built self-respect around decisiveness. You may believe that uncertainty exposes weakness. You may rush to brand your transition, announce a reinvention, or adopt a philosophy that makes detachment sound superior. But premature certainty is often the old persona wearing new clothes. The ego would rather become an expert on transformation than remain honestly transformed by what it does not yet understand. A man removes framed certificates from his study wall, then leaves the hooks in place. He carries the frames to a closet, but does not throw them away. For several weeks, he sits at the same desk before sunrise and writes a few lines no one will read. When his partner asks what the writing is for, he says, quietly, that he does not know yet. That answer can be more psychologically mature than a perfect plan. The unknown is not valuable because confusion is noble. It is valuable because it prevents you from filling newly opened space with the same old bargain. The psyche needs time to separate genuine inclination from reflexive compensation. What you are calling being lost may be the first period in years when you are no longer allowing an inherited map to lie on your behalf. Your detachment also exposes the unlived shadow beneath your former success. Jung called the shadow the parts of the personality that conscious identity refuses to recognize. The shadow is not only cruelty, selfishness, or destructive impulse. It also contains tenderness rejected as weakness, creativity dismissed as impractical, anger sacrificed for approval, pleasure condemned as indulgence, and ordinariness denied by the demand to be exceptional. Whatever does not fit the persona is pushed out of sight, but it does not cease to exist. Your old life may have required consistent shadow sacrifice. To remain admired, you silenced resentment. To remain productive, you ignored grief. To remain spiritual, you denied envy and appetite. To remain independent, you refused the wish to be cared for. To remain successful, you treated rest as moral failure. The life you wanted came with hidden admission rules, and certain parts of you were never allowed through the door. Eventually, those rejected parts stop lending energy to the arrangement. You can still perform, but the performance feels thinner. You can still achieve, but the achievement does not replenish you. The shadow does not always return as dramatic rebellion. Sometimes it returns as boredom, sometimes as procrastination, sometimes as an inability to feel impressed by the rewards that once controlled you. A woman sits in her car outside an awards dinner where her name will be announced. She checks her lipstick in the mirror, then rests both hands on the steering wheel. Through the glass doors, she sees colleagues gathering beneath warm lights. Her phone vibrates with a message asking where she is. She types, "Coming in now," but does not open the door for another 7 minutes. Those 7 minutes hold an entire conflict. One part of her knows how to enter, smile, receive the praise, and complete the identity. Another part is tired of being invited only when it remains polished and useful. Detachment becomes the compromise when neither part has yet learned how to speak to the other. What you are calling emotional distance may be the return of everything you had to exile in order to become the person your former dream required. The people around you may experience your individuation as a withdrawal of love. Jung knew that inner development disturbs relationships organized around unconscious agreements. Every stable bond contains expectations about who carries strength, who asks for little, who maintains harmony, who supplies excitement, and who remains predictable. When you stop wanting the life that sustained those roles, others may feel abandoned even if you have not physically left. They may remind you how lucky you are. They may say you are overthinking, becoming cold, or throwing away something good. Often, they are not consciously trying to control you. They are reacting to the disappearance of the version of you around whom they organized their own security. Your old desire made you legible. Your detachment introduces uncertainty into the whole system. This is where an old soul can become trapped by empathy. You feel the disappointment in the room before anyone names it. You understand why your change frightens them. You can trace their reaction to their own history, and because you understand it, you assume you must prevent it. Insight becomes another instrument of self-abandonment. You use compassion to negotiate against the truth that compassion revealed. A man sits at dinner while his parents discuss the house he once planned to buy near them. His mother mentions a listing and slides her phone across the table. He looks at the photographs, nods, and says the garden is beautiful. Then he turns the phone back toward her without saving the address, while his father folds a napkin into smaller and smaller squares. No one has shouted. Nothing visible has broken. Yet everyone senses that an old future is leaving the table. The silence feels personal, because shared fantasies often function like shared property. When one person withdraws belief, everyone feels the loss. What you are calling selfishness may be the painful end of performing certainty so that other people do not have to face change. Your sensitivity to impermanence can make conventional desire impossible to inhabit in the old way. The phrase "old soul" can become a flattering escape if it is used to claim superiority. Psychological age is not proof of spiritual rank. It is better understood as a style of consciousness marked by early inwardness, strong symbolic perception, and a persistent awareness that outer forms do not last. You notice the ending inside the beginning. Even in moments of success, you sense the machinery behind the applause. Even in love, you feel time moving. Jung's work on the second half of life speaks directly to this shift, though it can arrive long before middle age. The values that establish a person in the world eventually become insufficient for the descent inward. Expansion, mastery, acquisition, and social confirmation cannot answer every psychological need. At some point, the question changes from "what can you build?" to "what is your life asking you to become?" That question destroys certain fantasies, because becoming is not always compatible with possessing. You may get the role and lose the time needed for inner work. You may preserve the relationship and abandon the truth entering consciousness. You may maintain the image of success and become increasingly absent from your own days. Detachment begins when the psyche calculates a cost the ego has refused to include. A woman receives the contract she pursued for nearly 2 years. She reads the first page at her kitchen counter, signs the final line, and places the pen beside the paper. Her partner opens a bottle to celebrate. She watches the foam rise in the glass, touches the edge of the contract, and asks whether the window has always faced that much sky. The question seems unrelated, but it is not. Her attention has moved from the symbol of arrival to the fact of being alive. The contract may still matter. She may still honor it, but it can no longer carry the full burden of meaning. What you are calling detachment may be your refusal to spend the remainder of your life worshiping symbols after you have begun to hunger for direct experience. Yet direct experience is not the same as endless withdrawal. This is where the deepest difficulty begins. The uncomfortable truth is that your detachment can become a hiding place. Once you see through collective ambitions, you may begin to protect yourself with that insight. You tell yourself that ordinary goals are shallow, that conventional relationships are unconscious, or that people who still desire achievement have not awakened. The old persona was built around participation. The new persona can be built around refusal. Both can keep you from meeting the whole of yourself. Jung warned repeatedly about inflation, the condition in which the ego identifies with an archetypal position and begins to feel enlarged by it. The person who discovers hidden psychological truth may start to imagine that seeing through the game places them above the players. For an old soul, this inflation is especially seductive because it disguises fear as wisdom. You do not have to risk failure if you declare the prize meaningless. You do not have to risk intimacy if you describe attachment as unconscious. You do not have to make a difficult choice if you call every option an illusion. This is the shadow beneath the shadow. Some of your detachment may be true discernment, and some of it may be grief that has learned sophisticated language. Perhaps you wanted something deeply and did not receive it. Perhaps you came close enough to see that gaining it would not heal what you hoped it would heal. Perhaps the people attached to the dream disappointed you, or you disappointed yourself while pursuing it. If you turn detachment into an identity, you never have to admit how much you cared. You can stand outside desire and remain untouched, but only by becoming unreachable to life itself. A man deletes the social applications that once made him compare his life with everyone else's. For several weeks, he feels calm. Then a friend invites him to a small gathering, and he lets the message sit unanswered until midnight. He tells himself he has outgrown superficial company, although he has not asked who will be there. When he finally turns off the light, the untouched invitation remains brighter in his mind than the screen ever was. Withdrawal was necessary when the noise drowned out his own thoughts. It became defensive when silence was used to prevent any new experience from making a claim on him. The psyche does not withdraw energy from one form so that you can remain permanently uncommitted. It withdraws energy so that relationship can eventually be renewed on different terms. The cost of refusing that renewal is sterility. Your insight becomes accurate but bloodless. You can explain everyone's motives while revealing none of your own. You can recognize projection while never loving anything enough to project again. You can protect your peace until nothing living is permitted to disturb it. Then detachment ceases to be a passage and becomes a fortified identity. Jung's individuation was never a retreat into private purity. It required a return to the world with greater consciousness. The task was not to eliminate the persona, but to wear it without mistaking it for the self. The task was not to destroy desire, but to distinguish desire from compulsion. The task was not to escape relationship, but to meet another person with fewer unconscious demands. A mature inner life does not make participation unnecessary. It makes participation more honest. This means the life ahead may look less impressive while demanding more courage. You may choose work that does not repair your childhood image of worth. You may remain in a relationship, but stop playing the role that once guaranteed approval. You may leave something that is objectively good because it is psychologically finished. You may also discover that the outer form can stay while your reason for inhabiting it changes completely. No dream can decide this for you. No label such as old soul can decide it either. You must bear the tension between what has ended and what has not yet earned your commitment. You must allow grief without converting it into doctrine. You must admit where you are afraid, where you are proud, and where you still secretly hope the old world will beg you to return. The choice has a real cost. If you stop pretending to want your former life, some people will misunderstand you. Certain opportunities will expire. A version of your future will become unavailable, perhaps forever. Time already invested will not be refunded. The identity built around eventual arrival will lose its destination. You may have to disappoint people who loved the map more than they knew you. But the opposite choice has a cost as well. If you force desire back into a dead form, you will spend your energy animating what no longer has a life of its own. You may become efficient, admired, and inwardly absent. You may acquire the future and discover that the person who wanted it had to disappear in order to maintain it. There is no painless answer here. Individuation asks for sacrifice, and sacrifice means making something sacred by allowing something else to end. The question is not whether you will lose. The question is whether the loss will serve consciousness or postpone it. You are allowed to stop prosecuting yourself for changing. You are allowed to recognize that a former desire was sincere without treating sincerity as a lifetime contract. The person you were did not deceive you by wanting that life. That desire gathered your energy, protected your hope, and brought you to a threshold you could not have reached through insight alone. You do not honor that former self by repeating the wish forever. You honor that self by receiving what the wish made possible. You are also allowed to stop performing detachment as proof of depth. You do not need to become unreachable, unimpressed, or permanently removed from ordinary longing. If a simple pleasure returns, you may receive it. If ambition returns in a quieter form, you may follow it. If love asks you to risk dependence without surrendering yourself, you may not know the answer immediately. None of this cancels your awakening. It tests whether your awakening can become human. The psyche rarely gives its next direction as a complete picture. More often, it gives a slight increase of warmth. One conversation leaves you more present than expected. One kind of work holds your attention after the reward disappears. One room makes your breathing deepen. One truth becomes impossible to keep editing for other people's comfort. These are not commands. They are signs that energy is beginning to move again. Jung understood symbols as living bridges between conscious and unconscious life. Your next desire may first appear symbolically, through a repeated image, a persistent fascination, a dream, or an emotion that does not fit your current explanation. You do not have to force these signals into a plan. You can let them remain alive long enough to teach you their language. This is psychological permission, not passivity. You can meet practical obligations while refusing to manufacture enthusiasm. You can complete what must be completed without promising your identity to it. You can seek therapy when the emptiness becomes too heavy to carry alone. You can speak honestly without demanding that everyone approve. You can allow uncertainty to be a condition of truth rather than evidence of personal failure. The old life may still contain elements worth keeping. Detachment does not require dramatic destruction. Sometimes the relationship remains, but the rescuing ends. Sometimes the career remains, but the hunger for prestige falls away. Sometimes the home remains, but it stops serving as evidence that you have succeeded. Integration does not ask you to burn every structure associated with your persona. It asks you to stop using those structures to conceal your soul from yourself. A person returns to a familiar desk on Monday morning. The same messages wait, the same calendar fills the screen, and the same mug cools beside the keyboard. Yet one sentence is no longer repeated internally. This must prove that my life matters. The work becomes smaller, more limited, and strangely more bearable. Energy once spent making the role sacred becomes available for life beyond it. This is how desire can return without possessing you. You participate, but you do not ask participation to complete you. You care, but you do not turn caring into captivity. You commit, but you remain able to hear when the inner agreement changes. The ego makes plans, and the deeper psyche is permitted to answer. You began by fearing that your detachment meant you had lost ambition. Now you can see the more exact truth. You have lost the ability to be fully animated by a future that demanded an outdated version of you. That loss is painful because it removes both direction and disguise. It leaves you close to yourself before you know what to do with that closeness. You do not need to return to the person who wanted the old life, and you do not need to condemn that person in order to move beyond them. You can let the dream become what it always was beneath its literal form, a vessel that carried you until you were ready to reclaim the meaning you had placed inside it. Your detachment is not the final truth about you. It is the moment when borrowed desire loses its authority and conscious relationship with desire becomes possible. The life you once wanted may be ending, but your capacity to want is being returned to you in a form that can no longer survive on self-betrayal. If this resonates, subscribe to The Waking Shadow, where you can explore Jung's psychology for those walking the individuation path. Watch the video on your screen now to understand what happens when the psyche withdraws your energy from a life that no longer fits.